All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another Socialist Action Theory Thursday, where we dive into the thoughtful writings of revolutionary leaders, past and present. We are very excited to hear from our comrade Tom Baker tonight on Che Guevara's Man and Socialism in Cuba. Quick reminder that you can find Socialist Action content on our website, socialistaction.ca, through the Red Review Journal at redreview.ca, and through our accounts on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter X, and Facebook. If you're watching on YouTube and want to participate in the live discussion, please get in touch through our website or the email in the description. So, Tom is a retired veterinary epidemiologist living in Hamilton, Ontario. Tom told me that his first encountered the revolutionary socialist movement at U of Guelph in 1968 at a memorial for Che Guevara, sponsored by the Young Socialists, a predecessor of Socialist Action, LAS. If Che is a medical doctor could become a revolutionary socialist leader, then why not a veterinary student? Good question. Tom has been active in the Trotskyist movement since then and is currently a member of Socialist Action Central Committee. Welcome, Tom. Please take it away.
Thank you. Well, this was a refresh for me. I read this pamphlet several decades ago, and it turns out I didn't remember very much. But this pamphlet's really a letter from Che Guevara that was published in the Uruguayan newspaper Marcha in 1965, spring of 65. Che, as most people know, was a founding member and a central leader of the Cuban July 26 movement. One of his most important assignments after the overthrow of the US-backed dictatorship was to be president of the National Bank. So here you have a medical doctor who's head of the National Bank, and he was the Minister of Industries as well from 1961 to 65. This letter was written while he was on an extended tour of Africa. Guevara made contributions to the theory and practice of socialism in a brief period of 13 years.
I'm on a Zoom right now, so.
It's hard to believe, really, when you read various writings of Che and what he accomplished. This all happened between 1954 in Guatemala, when he radicalized until at the age of 39, he was killed by the agents of capitalism, by the CIA in Bolivia, where he was organizing a guerrilla group, or a part of a guerrilla group. This letter is critical, really, in understanding the aims and goals of the Cuban Revolution, as seen by one of its central leaders. Some of the things in this letter really show that Che is trying to provoke debate and get comrades thinking. He's offering a new perspective on some of the foundations of current socialist thought. The most important concepts of Che's writings on philosophy, economics, ethics, and politics are all referred to, summarized in this short letter. This letter or article really serves to synthesize Che's concept of the new man or woman emerging in Cuba, the individual as a direct and conscious actor in the actual process of constructing socialism. Cuba was creating what Che calls a new type of individual as a result of the revolution, because, as Che said, there's nothing that can educate a person like living through a revolution. I plan to more or less go through this letter chronologically, allowing Che to speak for himself. I'll be primarily paraphrasing and quoting Che, but I will provide some minimal contextual remarks. So a few quotations. One of them right at the beginning, Che says, a common argument from the mouths of capitalist propaganda spokespeople in the ideological struggle against socialism is that socialism, or the period of building socialism in which we have entered, is characterized by the abolition of the individual for the sake of the state. And I'm sure you've all heard that, comrades. Well, you know, in communism, you're just you're nothing as an individual. You know, you can't fulfill any personal ambitions. You're just a slave. And so he takes this up in quite a detailed way in the pamphlet. As a dialectical materialist, Che first sets out the historical facts of what's going on in Cuba, and then speaks to the mass engagement and also the role of the individual. So he examines The Invisible Laws of Capitalism, which is a really interesting introduction to a critique of, uh, of capitalism. The Individual and Socialism. He does talk too briefly about the dangers of sectarianism and dogmatism in the party in Cuba. And finally, he looks at some of the post-revolutionary challenges in the struggle to build socialism. So first, I want to talk about what he calls the first heroic stage. And he summarizes the history of Cuba's revolutionary struggle before and after the taking of power. The first major event is July 26, 1953, the attack on the Moncada barracks, which is well documented. Comments can read if they want to are interested in that. But Che says it was a disaster, and I think that does summarize what happened. Many people were killed. The survivors managed. A lot of them were imprisoned, but lo and behold, there was a general amnesty declared. I don't sure how long later, but they all got out. And the first thing they did was recommence the revolution armed struggle. During this campaign, in which, as Che says, there was only the germ of socialism, the individual was a fundamental factor. He said the triumph or failure of the mission depended on the individual's capacity for action in two distinct environments: the people, the still sleeping mass that had to be mobilized yet, and its vanguard, the guerrillas, the motor force of the mobilization, the generator of revolutionary consciousness and militant enthusiasm. This vanguard was the catalyzing agent that created the subjective conditions necessary for victory in January 1959. An interesting quote he talks about the individuals in the rebel army. Here again, in the framework of the proletarianization of our thinking, of this revolution that took place in our habits and our minds, the individual was the basic factor. Every one of the combatants of the Sierra Maestra who reached an upper rank in the revolutionary forces has a record of outstanding deeds to his or her credit. They attained their rank on this basis. In the attitude of our fighters could be glimpsed the man and woman of the future. So this new revolutionary government power now, after January 1959, it was initially based on the rebel army, but it initially also included, as Che calls them, the treacherous bourgeoisie. Is there any other type, right? Who tried to block measures to benefit the population, such as the agrarian reform law. Public pressure mounted, and they forced this bourgeois president to resign, and Fidel becomes the prime minister in July 1959, just 6 months after the overthrow. Workers and peasants became more militant, and the United States pressure against the new revolution grew in the face of sweeping nationalizations, land reform, free healthcare, education, etc. 2 years later, or less, on May Day, 1961, Fidel declared the socialist goal of the revolution. So he goes on to talk about the participation of the masses. He said the masses of people demonstrated their valor and sacrifice to defend the gains of the revolution and defeat any attempt to destroy it. And there are several examples he points to. There was the famous Bay of Pigs, when the U.S. mercenaries tried to invade an armed invasion of Cuba. It was turned back. The October missile crisis of 1962, Hurricane Flora of 1962, long list of events where the masses mobilized to defend their revolution. During this heroic stage, the masses also participated in the agrarian reform, the literacy campaign that engaged 1 million people as part of that, and the administration of state enterprises that were being set up. So Che goes on to say the masses are not a flock of sheep which follow Fidel blindly. He won their trust by interpreting their desires and aspirations, and from his sincere struggle to fulfill the promises he made. He agrees, though, that there is a subordination of the individual to the new state. He lays out a process whereby an initiative in the field of whether it's economy, culture, sports, or whatever is developed by the leadership, but it's explained and discussed with people who make it their own and carry out the task with enthusiasm and discipline. Che refers to the close dialectical unity between the individual and the mass, in which both are interrelated and at the same time, in which the mass, as an aggregate of individuals, intersects with its leaders. I was thinking, well, that's a little complex. And he says, Che says, he admits this is difficult for someone not living through the experience of the revolution to understand. He admits that the state makes mistakes on occasion, which causes a decline in collective enthusiasm. He's very candid. He says this can cause work to be paralyzed and then a correction has to be made. And he uses an example, the sectarian policy that was imposed by Annibale Escalante in 1962, where democratic centralism and the spirit of sacrifice were undermined. Just as a sidebar, Escalante was a leader of the PSP, which was the party representing the Stalinist leadership of the Soviet Union. He was Annibale Escalante's party. The PSP was part of the leadership at this time. During the fusion of the July 26 movement with the PSP, he attempted to take over the process to advance the CP line that Cuba was not at the stage to build socialism. That was for another time and place. So Che takes that up and talks about the impact that had on the harmful impact that had in the party. Of course, Escalante lost, and he wasn't successful in stacking the deck and having a majority in the leadership, was which he was intending. I want to talk now about the invisible laws of capitalism. Che reminds us that in capitalist society, alienated individuals are tied to society by an invisible umbilical cord, the law of value. This law shapes the course and destiny of our lives. He wrote an article in 1963 called On the Concept of Value that gets into this more deeply, where this debate on the role of Marx's full name of it is the labor theory of value within the construction of socialism. Che came up with a financial budgeting system called the budgetary finance system. It was based on the concept of enterprises being financed by the state budget directly and through centralized economic planning. This was the opposite of what the USSR economy was, how it was functioning. They had financially autonomous enterprises that organized their own credit and traded with each other and sold to each other. Che said that kind of a system would impede progress to socialism. So the budgetary finance system was the expression of his search for an apparatus to increase the productivity, the productive capacity, and labor productivity without relying on capitalist mechanisms, which were being used in the USSR. What he maintained, the USSR's approach was undermining the formation of new consciousness and social relations that were integral to communism. Che placed the withering away of alienation at the center of his theory of transition to socialism. He says, I'm not interested in dry economic socialism. We are fighting against misery, but we're also fighting against alienation. And I recall Marx said that there are two key sources of social alienation in capitalist society, the market and the state. Socialism presumes the withering away of both of those. So the next session deals with individual and socialism. The individual has a dual existence as a unique being and as a member of society. There's a certain incompleteness quality, a feeling of being an unfinished product in each of us. Continual labor is necessary to eradicate vestiges of the past in our consciousness. The past makes itself felt not only in our consciousness, but also the very character of the transition period while commodity relations persist. For Che, socialism could not exist if economics was not combined with social and political consciousness. Without an awareness of rights and duties, it would be impossible to construct a new society. Che argues that it wasn't capitalism's internal contradictions that caused the system to explode in Cuba. In neo-colonial countries, he says it's the national liberation struggle, and that's what it was in Cuba. And that created difficulties. It's extreme underdevelopment as a result of centuries of colonial and later on imperialist exploitation. And the other thing is the flight of capital that occurred during this after the revolution, making these two things contribute to make it a rapid transition to socialism impossible without sacrifices. Adding to the challenges that all the socialist projects face massive military, economic, and misinformation wars from the imperialist forces. And that's certainly true today. We can see that in every post-capitalist transitional society. They're under constant attack, military, economically, and propaganda wars. Someone asked Che once what were the problems that Cuba was facing. He said, well, there's two main problems: imperialism and imperialism, which kind of summarize the two aspects of the underdevelopment and the flight of capital. In Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels envisioned socialism and the problem of transition to it as a process in which the proletariat as a class will, and I'm quoting, wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the worker state, which it controls, and use them to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. The worker state will abolish land property and nationalize the property of those who flee the revolution or revolt against it. Other enterprises will be gradually transferred to the worker state. The goal is a producers' association in which the, quote, free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. This was mostly from the manifesto and also some of the earlier writings of Marx. Che explains the economic base for socialism must be constructed. And there is a temptation, he says, to use the dull instruments left over from capitalism as the lever to accelerate development. And he's referring here to commodity relations persisting as the economic cell, profitability, material interest. He says that this type of economic foundation undermines the development of consciousness. To build communism, it's necessary, simultaneous with new material foundations, to build the new man and woman. As Marx put it, key to this process will be the self-organization and self-activity of the working people to wither away all forms of alienation, subordination, and exploitation. The next section of the letter looks at the new consciousness, what that really means. The masses are mobilized, bringing together their collective and individual interests through moral and material incentives while deepening consciousness as a way of developing towards socialism. And I quote from Che, retaining the effectiveness of these incentives requires the development of a consciousness with a new scale of values. Society as a whole must be converted into a gigantic school. How was capitalist consciousness formed? He asks and answers it. Well, by force, education, and direct propaganda. And we know the propaganda, this concept of, self-made men, and inevitability of class society, the hope of improving your status, all that propaganda. For Cuba, direct hold among the masses and new attitudes become a habit. Masses make it their own and influence those not yet educated. Education must directly relate to production, he says, and be conducted in a collective manner to contribute to consciousness and have a greater impact. And he goes on to talk about the conscious process of self-education. He says, individuals feel the impact of this new social power and perceive that they don't entirely measure up to its standards, and so the urge for self-education. In this period of building socialism, we can see that the new man, woman emerging it's never a completed process, as it goes hand in hand with the development of new economic forms. He says some people remain solitary in trying to satisfy their own ambitions, but over time, they acquire consciousness of the need to incorporate into society and be part of the motor of that society. they would follow the vanguard party. They will follow the vanguard. And he defines the vanguard as the party, the advanced workers, and individuals in close communion. And he says the prize is the new society of communist human beings. The vanguard draws nourishment from the masses. Masses can only advance if the vanguard provides inspiration. He quotes that, or I quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat operates not only on the defeated class, but on individuals of the victorious class. He talks briefly about the state of institutionalization of the revolution. At this point, the party was still experimenting with the appropriate institutions that would permit a complete identification between the government and the community. They wanted a new structure appropriate to the special conditions of building socialism. They did not want bourgeois parliamentarism or any other form of bourgeois democracy. They strove to avoid a formality that separates the vanguard from the masses and the individual. He states, quote, the most important revolutionary aspiration is to see human beings liberated from their alienation. Despite the lack of a perfect mechanism yet, the masses are now making history as a conscious collective of individuals fighting for the same cause. He says the opportunities now for self-expression and making oneself felt in the social organism are infinitely greater. For Che, work was an important concept of his theory and approach. He argued that work played a crucial role in the construction of a new society. He analyzed the differences between work undertaken within a capitalist society, which we're all familiar with, and that which was free of alienation in a socialist society. And I quote, work no longer entails surrendering a part of one's being in the form of labor power sold, which no longer belongs to the individual, but becomes an expression of oneself, contribution to the common life in which one is reflected, the fulfillment of one's social duty. Che analyzed the inherited relations of production in Cuba and insists there are two fundamental changes required to end the exploitation of one human by another and achieve a socialist society. And certainly, number one was increase in production. And he said they should utilize the best technology available. And secondly, the deepening of consciousness, putting duty and sacrifice ahead of individual gain. He said it's still necessary to deepen conscious participation in all structures of management and production to link this to the idea of the need for technical and ideological education. In this way, the individual will reach total consciousness as a social being, which is equivalent to the full realization as a human creature, once the chains of alienation are broken. This will be translated concretely into the reconquering of one's true nature through liberated labor and the expression of one's own human condition through culture and art. There's a few sidebars here. Che uses right now, he critiques the scholasticism that has held back the development of Marxist philosophy and impeded a systematic treatment of the transition period. And this is clearly a reference to the Stalinist USSR at the time. And just to go back to the individualism, then he says, for a long time, individuals have been trying to free themselves from alienation through culture and art. Quotation, while a person dies every day during the 8 or more hours in which he or she functions as a commodity, individuals come to life afterward in their on the job goes on forever, but what keeps you going is hopefully the things that you're able to do in the off hours, particularly if it is a cultural nature. The solitary human being is seeking harmony with the world. One defends one's individuality, which is oppressed by the environment, and reacts to aesthetic ideas as a unique being whose aspiration is to remain immaculate. I'm not going to go into detail on Che's views on artistic experimentation, other than to say he says there's enormous changes taking place in society and in the power structure. Cuba is just emerging from this underdevelopment from neocolonial times when culture was imposed on them by a dominant class. There's constant struggle between values of the past and the attempt to construct an all-encompassing culture based on solidarity and real social justice. And he once again takes a swipe at social realism in the USSR as a bad way to go forward, as a glorifying past culture and then sort of creating a super reality. The capitalist superstructure imposes a kind of art in which the artist must be educated. Rebels are subdued by the machine, and only exceptional talents may ever create their own work. The rest are crushed. Meaningless anguish or vulgar amusement becomes the convenient safety valves for human anxieties. The idea of using art as a weapon of protest is combated. So he calls for a new ideological cultural mechanism that permits free inquiry and the uprooting of old weeds that multiply, as he called them. This would be based on the human being of the 21st century. Che talks a lot about youth and the role of the party and the revolutionary youth in the construction of a new society. He refers to youth as the malleable clay for which a new person can be built with none of the old defects. Quote, "We place our hope in the youth and prepare it to take the banner from our hands." And he talked about the importance of incorporating youth into work right from the beginning, encouraging physical work during vacations or along with studies, never as a punishment, as an opportunity. Says the party is a vanguard organization made up of the best workers, proposed for membership by fellow workers. The party would only become a mass party when the masses are educated for communism. Talks again about the role of the individual, the role of personality, a few paragraphs on how much he admires Fidel Castro's leadership style, how Fidel was able to make the individual feel more complete with more inner wealth and much more responsibility. This wasn't just about improving standard of living. And then comes my favorite quote. I used to have a poster on my wall of this with Che's picture. It said, "At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. A leader," end of quote, "a leader must combine a compassionate spirit with a cold intelligence to make painful decisions without flinching. They must idealize the love of the people, of the most sacred causes, and make it one and indivisible. They must have a large dose of humanity, a large sense of justice and truth, in order to avoid extremes, cold scholasticism, or isolation from the masses." He highlights the importance of world revolution, of proletarian internationalism as a duty and revolutionary necessity. I think some of you are familiar with the quote of "one too many Vietnams," is kind of a short form of what he's talking about. This is a glorious period of sacrifice. Cuba must make sacrifices because he said it's the vanguard of America, showing the Latin American masses the road to full freedom. And, I might add that that's certainly the way the United States saw Cuba and continues to see Cuba. That's why they hate it and want to overthrow the revolution. Finally, he returns to the dangers of dogmatism and revolutionary, those that are, leading revolutions that end up freezing the ties with the masses midway in the task, and also the concern about potential corruption of revolutionaries. He says the revolution is made by human beings, but individuals must forge their revolutionary spirit day by day. And he talks about, in the context of shortages, of revolutionaries have to ever be aware of succumbing to temptations, whatever, of grabbing more for themselves and their families than other people get. Just a conclusion, Che draws a list of some inspiring conclusions on freedom and the role of the individual, mobilizing the masses. I won't read them. Just sum up, the supplemental reading, which I'm not sure anybody would have time to get to, it's by Nayeri, on economic and political thought of Guevara. He summed up Guevara's socialism. He says, Guevara's socialism is deeply humanist. He contributed two key elements to the theory of socialism. He rejuvenated Marx's view of socialism as the process of de-alienation of humanity. And he viewed socialism not as a society of plenty, but as a society in which human development and self-realization take place. And that is why volunteer labor was central to his theory in life. Guevara was also exemplary as he practiced what he preached. The Cuban school children, the pioneers, if you've ever been to Cuba, you may have even seen signs and heard chants like this: "We will be like Che." That was just the chant. Perhaps a new generation will rise to learn from his example and will be like Che. The future of humanity will depend on it. So I'll wrap there and turn it over to you, Flo.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Tom. I really enjoyed hearing that. I'll add a couple comments and then open up the floor. Um, I'll end the recording soon. But yeah, I love that. Like, that resonates with me so much. Having a deeply humanist centered kind of socialism, and not being afraid to criticize dogmatism and a sort of rigidity, but actually championing, innovation and making mistakes and kind of trial and error and growing day to day. I think, that is key to a dialectician theory. And yeah, but sometimes it feels like in this day and age, maybe when we have settled into a lot of forms, or it's like I feel like there's a lot of allegations of reformism as soon as you try to deviate or try to innovate, or there's like this idea that there's this Marxist line and then anything else is just revisionist reformist and there's just no space for it. But I find when we actually dive into the texts as we were doing in these events, you find that the most dialectical leaders don't think that way at all, and they actually warn against that type of thing. So yeah, that part really resonated with me. All right, I'm just going to stop the recording.